Last month, some of America's top business people released a statement saying, among other things, quote, CEOs work to generate profits and return value to shareholders, but the best-run companies do more. It was part of a wider call for change in how companies do business. With us now for their perspectives, Phillip Haid. He's the co-founder and CEO of the social impact marketing agency Public Inc. Toby Heaps, CEO and co-founder of Corporate Knights Inc. and publisher of the Corporate Knights magazine. Tanya van Biesen, Executive Director, Canada, of the global nonprofit Catalyst. And we welcome back Sarah Kaplan, author of The 360-Degree Corporation, From Stakeholder Trade-offs to Transformation. And good to welcome everybody back, not everybody back, you two back, you for the first time on our program. Good to have everybody here. I just want to pick up from where we left off and get each of you to sort of weigh in on some point in the previous discussion that I had with Sarah that kind of captured your attention. Phillip, start us off if you would.
Yeah, so lots of what Sarah had to say I agree with. And I think the comment that CSR has been this siloed effort, right? That this sort of the side effort of companies is absolutely true. We work with lots of companies, and I can tell you that that shift, that transformation is still in the works.
More corporate social responsibility.
Yeah, trying to move them from this corporate social responsibility where it's this nice thing you do on the side to give back to community to actually how does this help you run your business? And we're seeing more and more of this shift is happening, but we still have a long way to go. And so I think that this, the more that we can push them to realize this is part of what's going to drive your business, things like product innovation, as an example, can have a huge impact. And we're seeing a lot of companies do that.
Tanya.
This is incredibly important work, so I'm delighted that Sarah wrote this book because what we are seeing through our work, so we are an organization that advocates for the advancement of women in the workplace, and we are seeing a very distinct movement in what is happening not only outside of the shareholder community, but actually shareholders also driving change for women's rights, for all kinds of, for climate change, all kinds of pressing global issues that we need to address. So this is great work, and I think it helps to highlight for organizations out there who haven't made this central to their business strategy, that it's possible to do that, and it's possible to be strategic in how you do it.
Toby.
I think it's great timing. I mean, we look at the planet, we see what's going on. We're brushing up against planetary limits. We look at social inequities, and we see people, not yet out with pitchforks, but we see certain people getting elected in parts of the world that suggest that there's a bit of a populist current, a revolt, so to speak, coming against the sort of the corporate market state that's been created. And so this notion that companies can take a more holistic sense and be part of the solution instead of driving the problem, it's timely.
Interestingly, a populist revolt from the right and the left, right?
Both
it's
sides.
Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, to a certain extent, in our own federal election campaign going on right now. We tried to book Milton Friedman for this show, but sadly, he is no longer with us. And so, however, Sheldon, why don't you bring this up? We're calling this graphic Move Over Milton Friedman. Nearly 200 chief executives, including the leaders of Apple, Pepsi, and Walmart, tried on Monday to redefine the role of business in society and how companies are perceived by an increasingly skeptical public. Breaking with decades of long-held corporate orthodoxy, the Business Roundtable issued a statement on the purpose of a corporation, arguing that companies should no longer advance only the interests of shareholders. Instead, the group said they must also invest in their employees, protect the environment, and deal fairly and ethically with their suppliers. So reported the New York Times a month ago. Okay, that's communism, isn't it? Isn't that just out and out? No, I'm teasing you here. But Milton Friedman, were he here today, would say that is absolute poppycock. Companies' jobs are to make money, and from that, all good things will flow. Why did the Business Roundtable here at the dawn of the 21st century suddenly disagree with that approach?
Well, I think in some ways some people have misinterpreted Milton Friedman in the sense that he always had said that if you do things that are good for your other stakeholders that lead to better performance on the bottom line, then that counts. And so a cynical interpretation of the Business Roundtable statement is simply that these are pressures that they're getting, as Tanya said, from investors and other people. So it just makes good, quote, business sense to make this decision. So if you were going to be cynical about the Roundtable decision, you could say it's actually quite Milton Friedman-esque in that it still is coupling it to financial performance. But I think that there's a positive side to it too, which is when you have almost 200 CEOs saying that they're going to do something other than just something for the shareholder, that gives them accountability, and it means we can hold their feet to the fire on that. So I think that's the positive side of it.
When you first heard that Business Roundtable, which is a group of high-ranking executives that
Right.
obviously report, is it monthly or regularly anyway, to the American public, what did you first think when you heard that?
Well, I thought that it is a natural pathway that they are taking given all the pressures post-2008 financial crisis when companies were blamed for a lot of these things. So in some ways it seemed natural, but in other ways I feel like it is a watershed moment that opens up the possibility to have these conversations that we're having here too, that says this is not just something that we're pushing up against the CEOs. Actually, the CEOs signed that. And it gives the possibility in people inside companies to say, hey, wait, you CEO, you signed that. That means that I have the scope and the freedom to actually have these conversations about the impact of our business and the trade-offs that we're making. So I think it's potentially very powerful, but the proof will be in the pudding.
Sort of. The proof of the pudding is in the eating.
Yes.
I think that's the second thing you thought. I think the first thing you thought was, damn, that's good timing for my book. That's what I think you first thought.
Well, you know, when you write a book, you finish it a year before it comes out, and you never know. So the fact that my book came out at this time is very fortuitous, but I think what I hope that it does is help us go from not just we commit to do it, but we now know how to do it. I want to get people to the doing, and the book is an intervention in that way.
What was your reaction when you heard what the Business Roundtable had to say, which, despite what the good Professor Kaplan has to say, I think does repudiate a lot of what Milton Friedman said over the years?
In all transparency, I had two reactions. One was a little bit of cynicism.
How come?
This idea that this could be simply, we've got to say this because there are pressures that are coming at us fast and furiously, whether it's populism, whether it's democratization of voice through, social media.
We got to say it, but we don't mean it.
Yeah, so I had a little bit of that, but then as I actually dug into it a little bit further, first of all, since they made their shareholder primacy statement back in 1997, 22 years have gone by, and a lot has changed in that time. A lot has changed for us as people who operate in the market and for them as CEOs. And the pressures that they face are quite different today than even 22 years ago. So to update that statement just makes sense. 22 years is a long time, so it actually makes sense for them to update it. And I would agree with Sarah, these are organizations, one of which, for instance, PepsiCo. So I was at a conference earlier this week where Indra Nooyi, the recently retired CEO of PepsiCo, said two things that I thought were very insightful. One, the job of a CEO is to extend the life of a company, to make the life of a company as long as possible, not just to be there for the life of the CEO. One. Two, her job, she felt as a CEO, and she was in that job for 12 years, which is 7 years longer than the average CEO. She said, I always believed that my success as a CEO would be judged by the success of my successor. So there are CEOs out there who do believe that they have to be part of the solution. In Pepsi's case, it was access to water and not overusing water or not littering the world with water or bottles, right? Plastic bottles. And so I actually think this is the coming together of now 200 very powerful CEOs acknowledging collectively we have to do something here because in the void of, for instance, big institutions like government, we have to step in.
Philip, your view on the roundtable?
I think it was amazing. I think we should be rejoicing. I understand why people are skeptical, but I actually think they have it wrong. And I'll tell you for two reasons. One is that when you think about how change happens, when you make statements, the way that Larry Fink did 2 years ago with his annual letter, it actually moves the needle. Right? We're seeing a rapid shift in how companies are thinking about social impact as part of their business.
Just take 30 seconds and fill us in on the Larry Fink letter.
So Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, in his annual letter, basically said that going forward, we're not going to invest in companies, right? The largest investment firm in the world. We're not going to invest in companies if they're not thinking about essentially what the roundtable said. If they're not thinking about other stakeholders in the way in which they do business. And so that was a big moment 2 years ago, and then he came and doubled down last year in his letter. This roundtable, yes, it's a statement of intent, but the reason I think the skeptics have it wrong is twofold. One is that when you think about how does progress happen, this is a big part of it, right? You make these statements and then you backfill on the reality. But the second point is these companies are doing all kinds of things. They have a long, long way to go. But when you do look at the supply chain, I mean, you talk, Sarah, in your book about Walmart. They have had a huge impact on the greening of the supply chain. It's enormous. When you look at people like the CEO of Chobani and what he's doing in terms of immigrant rights and in hiring them, and you look at companies like CVS that have become a healthcare company. I mean, there's more and more of these examples. So I actually think it's amazing. We should be celebrating. The real question on the table is, where are the Canadian companies? We're so far behind, it's crazy, and we need to make our own statement and move it forward.
We'll get to that. Okay, Toby, let me ask you the same thing. The reaction to the Business Roundtable letter.
So, similar to Phillip, I thought this is a game changer, and it's a game changer not for now. I don't think it's relevant for now. There's things we need to do to follow up to make it relevant, but it's a game changer because it changes the norms. When you have a group of 200, almost 200 of the most powerful executives in the United States saying, we're no longer going to kowtow only to the shareholder, that's a game changer. It goes beyond the law of Delaware, which is where many of them are domiciled or incorporated. And so from that perspective, I thought, great. And then
Do you want to explain why everybody's in Delaware?
Low taxes, good protections, less accountability. And I mean, he's also telling that one of the leaders of the statement was from J&J, Johnson & Johnson, which is now settling multi-billion-dollar lawsuits for the opioids scandals epidemic. And Jamie Dimon, who heads up Wall Street's largest bank, JP Morgan, which has been implicated in many other things and fined billions of dollars over the years for those things as well. So part of it, I was like, great news for the norms, because this is changing how people are going to look at the purpose of a corporation. But on the context side, you also have Elizabeth Warren talking about forcing labor and other direct members from other stakeholder groups onto the board of directors, which is really scary for them. You have her talking about all sorts of other accountability measures. So they can see the future coming down the pipe, and it's easier to bet on a future when you can see that it might be forced upon you. You might think, well, if I take a few steps, show some goodwill, maybe the medicine will be easier to take down.
Can I ask the business professor about that? I mean, Elizabeth Warren does have a rather controversial plank in her platform, and she has a plan for everything, as we know.
Right. Yeah.
But one of the planks in that platform is workers ought to have the right to vote for 40% of the members of a board of directors.
Right.
What do you think of that?
Well, it's a model that exists in the world. That's what they have in Germany.
Not in America, it doesn't.
Not in America, that is for sure. I think many people will obviously see that as highly controversial, but it's not that model doesn't. She didn't pull that plan out of nowhere. That's how it works in Germany, where you have the members of the labor union are actually represented in the board of the companies, and so it is a way of having at least one stakeholder, who's the worker, to have their voice at the table. It doesn't put the voice of other stakeholders at the table. And so you want to think about what is the best way to have all of those voices at the table to have those heard. But yes, of course, companies are going to be quaking in their boots about a proposal like that. My guess is that if and when Elizabeth Warren is elected President of the United States, that that might not be the very first thing that she does, and that these kinds of things will maybe potentially evolve in terms of the suggestion. But it could be also the fear of regulation is one of the things that keeps companies in line. You don't necessarily always have to regulate them. If there's a threat of regulation, then they self-regulate, and we could claim that this statement by the Business Roundtable is an attempt to do that.
Does that offend your sense of what corporations ought to be allowed to or ought to be forced to do?
No, I think we have to differentiate between private and public. And I think actually if you look at the most progressive companies, they actually think about their people first. And so while it would scare, Elizabeth Warren's suggestion would scare a lot of companies, actually the companies who are going to be successful in the long term are actually thinking about their people. And so, whether or not they would go along with it is a question, but I don't think it would scare them at their heart. If they're a private company, it's different than a publicly traded company.
Can I get you to follow up, Toby, on, and we should just say for the record here, who was your great-grandfather?
A. Heaps, he was pretty instrumental in passing the Old Age Pension Act and unemployment insurance in Canada.
Was he not one of the founders of the
CCF,
the precursor to the NDP?
Yeah.
So he has, your family, you have inherited a populist streak from the left side from your great-grandfather. Okay, we'll put that on the record. You do Corporate Knights, the magazine, and you did you had an article recently in which you kind of laid out a path by which shareholders can increasingly flex their muscles in order to make companies behave in a way that you would think would be better. Can you lay that path out for us and explain how that might work?
Sure. So I think shareholders, I mean, part of where this is coming from too is we've seen innovation go like this outside of a few notable technology companies. And a big part of that is because investment in R&D and deployment of R&D has gone down because the capital now is being returned to shareholders through share buybacks and dividends. And so part of this is you don't generate wealth if you don't invest in innovation. And I think investors see that. Investors also, they're not looking at today. Investors are looking at what is the world going to look like tomorrow, because we want to be betting on growth. And so increasingly they're looking for companies to align their capital expenditures and R&D. And we're talking about, where is there going to be growth? Well, we're seeing a massive transition in our energy system. We're seeing the electrification of transportation, electric cars. We're seeing renewable energy, smart grids roll out. We're seeing plant protein diversification from animals. So investors increasingly are looking at companies and seeing how are they positioned today, but more importantly, how are they investing in the tomorrow that we are betting on? And that's really where leadership comes in. And how do you interpret the future? Are we going to have a darker future or a brighter future? And then you have to justify that with data.
I'd like your sense, Tanya, about how much you think shareholders care about the companies that they've invested in acting with corporate social responsibility versus just make as much bloody money for me as you can because I want to have a nice pension at the end of the day.
So I really think it's both. And I think it's interesting, we are separating shareholders from consumers, from employees, they're often all the same people, one, so we need to make sure that there's overlap in these groups. Two, we see a lot of investor activity on these issues. So they care because they care about the longevity of the company. They're not looking just for next quarter's return. They're looking for 20, 30, 50 years. If we're talking about resource companies in Canada, which we should, which is such a huge part of our economy, these companies can absolutely be a part of our climate change solutions. They have the most money, the most talented geoscientists and engineers. They can be part of the solution. But part of what we need to do is stop looking at everything in a binary way. This company does bad, therefore they are in a sunset industry and must exit the economy. This company does good and therefore is the future. We have to actually live in a period of gray where these companies start to figure out how can we contribute to the solution, how can we start to take away emphasis on these other businesses and move forward. And I think investors are incredibly interested in that.
I'd like to know, though, how you think, Sarah, the penny drops for an executive who has spent his or her whole life believing that his or her sole job was maximizing shareholder value. And I think it was you, Phillip, who said, now that the pitchforks may be coming,
Right.
How do you get that change in mindset that says, I do have to start thinking about other stakeholders, I do have to think about the trade-offs, I do have to think about transformation?
Right. Well, and we even have this battle inside our program at the Rotman School because I have my finance colleagues basically teaching the Milton Friedman model and telling me I shouldn't be teaching the more integrated model.
Good fights with that?
Yeah, sometimes. And so I get students in my class who are saying, but really it's all about the bottom line. I think what we're pointing out in this conversation is that our understanding of that bottom line has radically changed. And even if you just cared about the shareholder, 1/3 of dollars invested in the world now is going to what we call ESG funds, or some kind of, which is environmental, social, and governance, paying attention to social goods in some way. 1/3 of money. You have Larry Fink at, talking about, he runs, BlackRock, which has over $1 trillion that is being invested along these principles. So even for the people who have drunk the Kool-Aid of it all that matters is the shareholder has changed at this point. And then if you start to take into account the famous millennials that everyone is afraid are not going to want to stay employed, it turns out that there is a generation of people who really aren't going to work for companies that aren't socially responsible in some way. And so even if you just care about the bottom line, you're going to have to care about all these other stakeholders. I think there's many other reasons to do it, but my reasoning to those people who feel like Milton Friedman is still at the center of the universe is that even if you care about that, you are now, because of where we are in society, going to have to think about the other stakeholders.
Because I'm assuming, Phillip, that by the time you deal with a company, they are socially aware enough, because they've come to you, that they want to do not just make as much money as possible, but do some good as well. But when you're making your pitches to companies who may not necessarily see that connection, what's the thing that you say to them that makes the penny drop, that makes them realize, oh, I've got to worry about more than just shareholder value?
It's very difficult, because if the leadership's not there, leadership still matters a whole lot. And I totally agree with what's being discussed. It's happening now at the board level as well, but we're not nearly as far as we would like to be at the board level. So if the CEO, if he or she is not open to it, the only argument that I find works the best is on the employee side, on employee attraction and retention. To get them to buy that social impact, social purpose could actually help you acquire customer, retain customer, sell product. It's hit and miss. We've actually proven that it works, but it's hit and miss with them if they don't buy it. So the
It's
people
hit and miss as an argument, you mean?
as an argument. But I think what we're also finding, so leadership matters a lot, and so the people side of it is you're going to lose really good people. They're asking, and so all they have to do is ask their VP of HR, and they will tell them that they're actually saying in your annual reports, show me what you're doing to actually have a good, clean supply chain. Show me what you're doing to give back to community. Show me what you're doing to ensure that we've got some kind of carbon plan. And so when you see things like Amazon and 4,500 workers walking out and saying, what the hell, Jeff Bezos, right, with these giant boxes, like that's material now. So that's the best argument for people who don't believe. For those that do, is actually about showing them how to integrate it and why the consumer is actually asking for it, even though there are real contradictions on the consumer in terms of what they say and what they do. Because people will purport to do all the right things and will pay more and go out of their way for the good company, but the truth of the matter is we're not there yet, and they still go to convenience, they still go to quality, and they still go to price.
If I may just, one of the best current examples, relatively current examples, of where Milton Friedman was dead wrong was you had a relatively laggard company, Kraft, try and do a hostile takeover of Unilever, which is considered a poster child of sustainable companies. And Unilever fought like heck to prevent that takeover. Normally you would get a hostile takeover would go over because they're offering a superior price for their shares. And then let's look what happened. Kraft's share price went like this. They've destroyed billions of dollars of shareholder value. Unilever has continued to be strong. That would have been a lot of value destroyed if the short-term shareholders would have won. So a lot of this has to do with time perspective, whether you're taking a short or long-term. And that's where you can reconcile a lot of the social responsibilities if you take a long-term perspective.
Should we play this clip now, Meredith? Why don't we hear from John Manley? John Manley was Deputy Prime Minister of the country. He represented, he was the head of a Business Council National, BCNI, wasn't it?
BCC, Business Council of Canada.
Business Council of Canada, right. Okay, let's hear what he had to say about all this. Sheldon, if you would, let's roll that clip.
Businesses don't actually exist to create jobs. They actually exist in order to make profits on behalf of their shareholders, and that's got to be their principal responsibility. Otherwise, CEOs find themselves out of work. So that's not what they're there for.
I know when a former Liberal Deputy Prime Minister of the country said that, there were some people who thought, what has happened to him? But that represents classic traditional business thinking. Yeah. Is it wrong?
Well, it's wrong for all the reasons that we've have been talking about so far. So I think that it's, that's why I say it's almost like you drink the Kool-Aid. It's become, it was an ideology that so many people imbibe, but now we are understanding from these other pressures. Now the challenge is, if you've grown up in a particular system, you've been successful in a particular system, it's very hard to give up on that. And so I talk about in my book this idea that people actually, we call it systems justification theory. They actually want to justify the system they're in, because if they don't justify it, then they lose their own place in understanding in society.
Cuts away at the very foundation of everything they've done, I guess.
Absolutely. And so I think we are at this moment where we are seeing people needing to shift their understanding of their role and shift the ideology. And I think that's why the Business Roundtable thing is so important, is because now you have a whole bunch of people who have signed together that they're going to do it. So it's not just the one CEO of Unilever putting up his hand and saying we need heroic CEOs. They have all held hands and jumped in together, and I think that actually helps each one of them fly air cover for each other as they go into this gray area of experimentation that we're talking about right now.
Tanya, let me do this with you. I have seen studies that suggest it is an empirically provable fact that the more women you have at the board of directors table or in positions of senior management, the better the company will do. You're nodding. That's true.
Sarah and I have wonderful discussions about this, but yes, I am nodding.
Tell me why that's the case.
So I think this picks up a little bit on what Phillip was saying. The more we have diversity, whether it's diversity, more women, more immigrant, people of color, more consumers or employees, the more we have different perspectives. The more we have different perspectives, the more we see more innovative thinking. That's why it generates greater outcomes. But if I build on what Phillip was saying, what we've seen where organizations have been successful in integrating broader stakeholders, whether it's consumers, employees, as well as their shareholders, is when they make it central to their business strategy. When companies do it off the sides of their desks, as Phillip was describing, it doesn't tend to work. It's an appendage, it's an afterthought. In my case, as I advocate for women in the workplace, where companies have made it central to their talent strategy, where they've done the simple math that says, if 3% of my leaders are women, how can I possibly have the best talent at the table? That just doesn't make sense in a normal distribution curve.
Or understand what half my customers want.
Right. So when they make it central to their talent strategy, their product strategy, their marketing strategy, that's when they make progress.
If that's so blindingly obvious, why are women still such a small percentage of the C-suite, of boards of directors, et cetera?
Sarah described it well in systems justification. There are lots of systems and institutions that support a certain view of leadership, right? And we still have a certain view of leadership that is
60-year-old
largely
white man.
Yeah, I'd say like 53-year-old white man, right?
Okay.
But that's if you ask young children today to draw a leader, by and large, they will draw that image because of a lot of consumption of media and things that were shown over and over. So these are institutionalized. So we have to change the systems.
You said a moment ago, Phillip, that in the States, as a result of the Roundtable statement, they are well ahead of where you would like to see us be in Canada.
Yeah.
Is there anybody in Canada doing it the way you like to see it done?
So I'm a big fan of Maple Leaf Foods and Michael McCain. Now we work with them, so maybe I should put that bias on the table. But I'm a fan because Michael, as a leader, is willing to speak what he believes. He's not afraid to talk about where they're succeeding, where they're failing, and is really willing to be a voice, and particularly on the issue of food insecurity, which is where they're putting a lot of their energies. But they're making moves into plant-based, which, as Toby talked about earlier, is a huge industry. But by and large, I don't find most CEOs of companies, which are still, exactly to your point, are still white males in their mid-50s. By and large, they haven't sort of decided that taking stands on issues is actually part of what they need to do as a business, right? And so as a result, you don't see a lot of Canadian companies really standing out in terms of the issues. So we have a different climate in Canada than we do in the US. But when you see the recent statement from Walmart on gun violence and not selling ammunition in their stores and saying, even in states where you can carry a gun, we're asking you not to. Howard Schultz did that with Starbucks a few years previous to that. You've got people like Chip Berg at Levi's who are talking about gun violence as well. That's a very contentious issue. But in Canada, we've got issues, right? We have Indigenous issues that we don't want to talk about. We have climate issues that CEOs are not talking about. We've got homeless issues that we're not talking about. So there's so many issues that are directly relevant to companies that actually will have a negative impact on their bottom line if they don't get out in front of it, and they're not talking about it.
Can I give you
Please.
a statistic on this? Because in the United States, for example, we see every company has to put out an annual report, but many companies are now doing social responsibility reports or sustainability reports. In the United States, 86% of the S&P 500 companies put out these reports. In Canada, if you look at the TSX composite, it's about 50%. And so the companies are not even doing the analysis that you would need to do a report. And I think once you do those reports, you have the data, you also have accountability to be making progress. And so we don't even see Canadian companies doing that kind of part, the bare minimum part of actually documenting where they stand on these issues and setting targets to move forward.
Can I be controversial on this?
Please do. We don't mind that here.
I tend to disagree. I don't think Canadian companies are behind in the way that you've expressed. We've got two different systems. First of all, we've got a government system that has historically been much more involved in the social fabric than the US has. So I think that actually changes actions and reactions of companies. If the modern day Business Council of Canada is very clear that they never had a shareholder primacy statement. They've always asked their members to contribute to sound policy, public policy, that both builds the Canadian economy and contributes to the social fabric of Canada. So that has been the understanding of these organizations. Now, I agree with you, Sarah, they can do a lot more to be public on what they're doing, but I think we do have a couple of good examples beyond Michael McCain. I think the banks do use their heft behind certain issues, certainly as it relates to women in the workplace. They do a lot of work. And I think that you could point to organizations that have done a ton of work around newcomers to Canada. So the experiences of immigrants to Canada, for instance, or LGBTQ rights. So those are a couple of examples. I think what Bell has done for mental health in this country is tremendous.
Huge.
So that's another example of an organization that has really stepped out and used their huge voice on that issue. So I'm not as down on Canadian companies.
Can I just say though, but here's where I agree with that, but lots of Canadian companies, the banks are a great example, are doing all kinds of work in a number of areas. Canadian Tire is doing great work on trying to get kids playing sports and access to sports. But we have a temperament in this country that we don't like to advocate for issues in a very public domain. So George Cope and Bell has done lots for mental health, but the real issue is access to services. I have not seen the CEO of Bell come out and talk about the gap that exists in access to service. They put money in a foundation, then do marketing.
They're focused on stigma and that kind of thing.
Right, which is really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we have a climate march coming out next week on the 27th. How many Canadian companies have actually said we're going to go dark on that day and we're going to give our staff the time off to go and march? We did our company. We're a B corporation, so the B Corps are all there. But you don't see, it's not in the DNA of Canadian companies and CEOs to think that they need to get out in front to actually demonstrate to their employees and to their consumers, if they're business to consumer, that it's really important to start to lean into these issues. So they do it behind the scenes, and that has huge value, but I don't think it's enough in this day and age.
The guy from Public Inc. gets the last word. Oh, actually, I'm going to take the last word. I'll plug your book if you don't mind. The 360-Degree Corporation, from Stakeholder Trade-offs to Transformation. Sarah Kaplan from the Rotman School of Business at U of T. Toby Heaps on the other side of the table with her. Tanya van Biesen and Phillip Haid. We're really glad all of you came into TVO tonight for this very timely conversation. Thanks so much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.